guy that started following me in the woods. As a bit of backstory, I'm from a really rural area and have recently moved to the city for university. I'd started to feel a bit homesick and missing the countryside, so I decided to go on a walk in the woods close to my accommodation. I live on the outskirts of my city. It was still light when I started my walk, about 2 p.m. With it being winter, it's been getting to be pitch black at about 4:30. After about an hour and a half of walking, I noticed that it was starting to get pretty dark, so turned back because I didn't want to be in a forest I'd never been in before in total darkness, mainly in case I got lost. On my way back, I saw a guy in maybe his early 20s, obviously drunk with a plastic bag full of bottles of alcohol and muttering to himself. As I was on a path with steep slopes on either side, I was pretty much forced to walk past him, doing so with keeping as much distance as possible between myself and him and keeping my eyes focused straight ahead. As soon as I passed him, his muttering became much louder and I was sure he was trying to talk to me, but it was still unintelligible, so I ignored him. Then I heard him yelling and turned around to see him walking towards me. There was about 10 meters between us. I still couldn't make out what he was saying, but he was walking quickly towards me and eyeing me up and down with a really creepy look on his face, not wanting to have any trouble, especially considering I'd only seen one other person quite a while beforehand. I simply said, "Nah, leave me alone." He clearly heard as I saw him register my sentence through his drunken brain, yet he simply shook his head and carried on walking towards me. At this point, I panicked, pulled out my phone and shouted, "I'll call the police." I knew this was an empty threat considering the fact that I didn't even know the name of the forest and knew that it'd be a long time before the police would get to me. Not to mention my phone was at 10% before I'd even left and knew that most of that had gone on taking photos. I guess in this case I was lucky he was drunk as he froze, put his hands up and mumbled, "All right," before beginning to back away. I walked quickly away, looking several times over my shoulder to check if he was following me. It's probably a good thing I did, seeing as each time I looked he was facing me. Maybe to check to see if I would notice before he could get to me. Like I said, this could have been nothing and have simply been a homeless drunk guy that I blew out of proportion. Either way, next time I go for a walk, I'm fully charging my phone and taking a kitchen knife with me. Anyway, drunk, creepy guy that may or may not have had bad intentions, let's not meet. Hiding in the night from a stranger in a car. So this happened to me around 10 years ago or so, when I was around 18 or 19. At the time, I was in a new relationship, still in the early stages when everything was brand new and an adventure. My girlfriend came from a well-off family and had very strict parents who weren't fond of her being out much, nor of our social group, so it was often difficult to meet. To this end, we would regularly sneak out of our houses and meet up around 1 a.m. and stay out most of the night. The road that she lived on was an upper middle class area connected to a lark park / forest / river walk that by day was a very popular destination for joggers, kayakers, and dog walkers, but by night was a hotspot for drug dealers, doggy folk, and doggers. Not the safest place to go at night, but a regular haunt nonetheless. On a different occasion, my friends and I nearly stumbled on a drug deal whilst we all realistic airsoft rifles on us. You would think I would learn. Anyway, so this night I head to her lane and wait around outside. I should mention that I look very out of place with scruffy hair and a long coat. That, and it's 1 a.m. She is delayed getting out for some reasons that now escape me, so I decided to chill for a while out of the way and wait. Location-wise, I am at the side of a road with 2 large fields, either side of which both have a large tree and hedge line between them and the road. After maybe 20 to 30 minutes, I hear a car driving up the road towards me, and I get this horrible gut reaction telling me to get off the road. I felt like Frodo sensing the impending arrival of Nazgul. I quickly climbed over the hedge and dropped down prone on the other side and stay as still as possible and hear the car slow down as it approaches where I have been standing and wait. I'm fairly certain the driver must have seen me. The car stays there, and no one leaves. The engine idles, and they just stay at that spot on the road waiting, I assume, to spot me again. I am terrified. I have no idea who they would be, but I can't shake that horrible feeling in my gut at all. I hide for what felt like hours, but in reality would have been no more than 30 minutes. The car eventually drives on heading towards the car park for the west, and dead end. I still can't shake the fear and don't want to risk getting caught, but also didn't feel safe. So I moved to the opposite side of the road and hid behind the other hedge. Soon enough, I heard the familiar sound of an engine as the car comes back down and again stops nearby where I had been waiting. They hung around for another 20 minutes or so before driving away again, this time for good. I can't remember how long it took me to get the courage to leave eventually. In hindsight, the rational part of my brain likes to just think that someone had just phoned the police on the scruffy guy loitering around after midnight, but I'm not really sure. Their behavior felt very off, and the feeling in my gut was like nothing I've felt since. At the time, I couldn't shake the fear of this unknown person just sitting in a car waiting for me to try and move, much like a hunter waiting patiently for prey. Best part? At some point during the night, my girlfriend advised she couldn't get out that night anymore. So I just went home. Driver of the car, let's not meet. Screaming forest at night. This happened a couple years ago when I was 16. It was warm summer night. At nights like these, me and my friend would often grab a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of beer each, and go outside to enjoy them. We came from a really small town where everybody is somehow connected, so the only way for us to drink and smoke without our parents knowing was to do so in secluded places. Luckily, the town is surrounded with huge forests. We were both very familiar with them, since we practically grew up there. This one time, it was night as usual. We both grabbed our forbidden contraband, some flashlights, and we headed out. We took the path through the long meadow, which ended at the edge of the forest. From there led a path through the forest by which it's a 20-minute walk back to town in steep downhill terrain. At the place where the meadow and the forest meet, there is a gazebo with a fireplace where people go for picnics. As we were walking through the meadow, we would stop a few times to ensure from afar that the gazebo was unoccupied. It was around 11 p.m. and the night was incredibly dark. Even though we were out in the open, we had to use our flashlights to see anything. When we made sure that the air was clear, we approached the gazebo to light our first cigarette. We were just standing there, puffing and talking, while always scouting our surroundings with the beams of our flashlights. After maybe 5 minutes, we decided to take the path through the forest back to town. We walked about 30 meters, at which point we couldn't see the place where we were previously standing. That's when we heard it. From the gazebo where we were standing just seconds earlier came a long, terrifying scream. It sounded as if somebody, a man by the sound of it, was being cut to pieces while still very much alive. The kind of scream that turns your blood to ice instantly. After the first scream, there was a pause for a few seconds. During this whole time, we were both so scared we couldn't even move. Then, it started again, even louder and more terrifying. The second scream snapped us back into reality. Without a word, we just started sprinting through the rough terrain, not once looking back. At this point, I was so pumped up with adrenaline that I couldn't hear anything except my heartbeat resonating in my ears. We've never run that fast, and we didn't stop until we reached the lights of town. When we finally did, we both just sat on a sidewalk under a lamppost. panting and gasping for air. Nobody said anything for a good 30 minutes, but from my friend came a single but quite elegant word. Fuck! After a while, we started talking about it. We came up with a conclusion that either somebody was having fun at our expense or somebody got really hurt. At the end, we decided to head back there the first thing in the morning. But surprise, surprise, no signs of anyone being injured or anyone struggling. We decided that it was just someone playing pranks on us. However, to this day it keeps gnawing at me. Something just doesn't add up. We were standing there for quite some time, so the person must have been very well hidden. On the other hand, it would be almost impossible for anyone to just walk in there without any kind of light since it was so dark. And even if he had some kind of torch, we would certainly spot him. Anyway, screaming man in the forest, let's not meet. Guy that started following me in the woods. As a bit of backstory, I'm from a really rural area and have recently moved to the city for university. I'd started to feel a bit homesick and missing the countryside, so I decided to go on a walk in the woods close to my accommodation. I live on the outskirts of my city. It was still light when I started my walk, about 2 p.m. With it being winter, it's been getting to be pitch black at about 4:30. After about an hour and a half of walking, I noticed that it was starting to get pretty dark, so turned back because I didn't want to be in a forest I'd never been in before in total darkness, mainly in case I got lost. On my way back, I saw a guy in maybe his early 20s, obviously drunk with a plastic bag full of bottles of alcohol and muttering to himself. As I was on a path with steep slopes on either side, I was pretty much forced to walk past him, doing so with keeping as much distance as possible between myself and him and keeping my eyes focused straight ahead. As soon as I passed him, his muttering became much louder and I was sure he was trying to talk to me, but it was still unintelligible, so I ignored him. Then I heard him yelling and turned around to see him walking towards me. There was about 10 meters between us. I still couldn't make out what he was saying, but he was walking quickly towards me and eyeing me up and down with a really creepy look on his face, not wanting to have any trouble, especially considering I'd only seen one other person quite a while beforehand. I simply said, "Nah, leave me alone." He clearly heard as I saw him register my sentence through his drunken brain, yet he simply shook his head and carried on walking towards me. At this point, I panicked, pulled out my phone and shouted, "I'll call the police." I knew this was an empty threat considering the fact that I didn't even know the name of the forest and knew that it'd be a long time before the police would get to me. Not to mention my phone was at 10% before I'd even left and knew that most of that had gone on taking photos. I guess in this case I was lucky he was drunk as he froze, put his hands up and mumbled, "All right," before beginning to back away. I walked quickly away, looking several times over my shoulder to check if he was following me. It's probably a good thing I did, seeing as each time I looked he was facing me. Maybe to check to see if I would notice before he could get to me. Like I said, this could have been nothing and have simply been a homeless drunk guy that I blew out of proportion. Either way, next time I go for a walk, I'm fully charging my phone and taking a kitchen knife with me. Anyway, drunk, creepy guy that may or may not have had bad intentions, let's not meet. Hiding in the night from a stranger in a car. So this happened to me around 10 years ago or so, when I was around 18 or 19. At the time, I was in a new relationship, still in the early stages when everything was brand new and an adventure. My girlfriend came from a well-off family and had very strict parents who weren't fond of her being out much, nor of our social group, so it was often difficult to meet. To this end, we would regularly sneak out of our houses and meet up around 1 a.m. and stay out most of the night. The road that she lived on was an upper middle class area connected to a lark park slash forest slash river walk that by day was a very popular destination for joggers, kayakers, and dog walkers, but by night was a hotspot for drug dealers, doggy folk, and doggers. Not the safest place to go at night, but a regular haunt nonetheless. On a different occasion, my friends and I nearly stumbled on a drug deal whilst we all realistic airsoft rifles on us. You would think I would learn. Anyway, so this night I head to her lane and wait around outside. I should mention that I look very out of place with scruffy hair and a long coat. That, and it's 1 a.m. She is delayed getting out for some reasons that now escape me, so I decided to chill for a while out of the way and wait. Location-wise, I am at the side of a road with 2 large fields, either side of which both have a large tree and hedge line between them and the road. After maybe 20 to 30 minutes, I hear a car driving up the road towards me, and I get this horrible gut reaction telling me to get off the road. I felt like Frodo sensing the impending arrival of Nazgul. I quickly climbed over the hedge and dropped down prone on the other side and stay as still as possible and hear the car slow down as it approaches where I have been standing and wait. I'm fairly certain the driver must have seen me. The car stays there, and no one leaves. The engine idles and they just stay at that spot on the road waiting, I assume, to spot me again. I am terrified. I have no idea who they would be, but I can't shake that horrible feeling in my gut at all. I hide for what felt like hours, but in reality would have been no more than 30 minutes. The car eventually drives on heading towards the car park for the west, and dead end. I still can't shake the fear and don't want to risk getting caught, but also didn't feel safe. So I moved to the opposite side of the road and hid behind the other hedge. Soon enough, I heard the familiar sound of an engine as the car comes back down and again stops nearby where I had been waiting. They hung around for another 20 minutes or so before driving away again, this time for good. I can't remember how long it took me to get the courage to leave eventually. In hindsight, the rational part of my brain likes to just think that someone had just phoned the police on the scruffy guy loitering around after midnight, but I'm not really sure. Their behavior felt very off, and the feeling in my gut was like nothing I've felt since. At the time, I couldn't shake the fear of this unknown person just sitting in a car waiting for me to try and move, much like a hunter waiting patiently for prey. Best part? At some point during the night, my girlfriend advised she couldn't get out that night anymore. So I just went home. Driver of the car, let's not meet. Screaming forest at night. This happened a couple years ago when I was 16. It was warm summer night. At nights like these, me and my friend would often grab a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of beer each, and go outside to enjoy them. We came from a really small town where everybody is somehow connected, so the only way for us to drink and smoke without our parents knowing was to do so in secluded places. Luckily, the town is surrounded with huge forests. We were both very familiar with them, since we practically grew up there. This one time, it was night as usual. We both grabbed our forbidden contraband, some flashlights, and we headed out. We took the path through the long meadow, which ended at the edge of the forest. From there led a path through the forest by which it's a 20-minute walk back to town in steep downhill terrain. At the place where the meadow and the forest meet, there is a gazebo with a fireplace where people go for picnics. As we were walking through the meadow, we would stop a few times to ensure from afar that the gazebo was unoccupied. It was around 11 p.m. and the night was incredibly dark. Even though we were out in the open, we had to use our flashlights to see anything. When we made sure that the air was clear, we approached the gazebo to light our first cigarette. We were just standing there, puffing and talking, while always scouting our surroundings with the beams of our flashlights. After maybe 5 minutes, we decided to take the path through the forest back to town. We walked about 30 meters, at which point we couldn't see the place where we were previously standing. That's when we heard it. From the gazebo where we were standing just seconds earlier came a long, terrifying scream. It sounded as if somebody, a man by the sound of it, was being cut to pieces while still very much alive. The kind of scream that turns your blood to ice instantly. After the first scream, there was a pause for a few seconds. During this whole time, we were both so scared we couldn't even move. Then, it started again, even louder and more terrifying. The second scream snapped us back into reality. Without a word, we just started sprinting through the rough terrain, not once looking back. At this point, I was so pumped up with adrenaline that I couldn't hear anything except my heartbeat resonating in my ears. We've never run that fast, and we didn't stop until we reached the lights of town. When we finally did, we both just sat on a sidewalk under a lamppost, panting and gasping for air. Nobody said anything for a good 30 minutes, but from my friend came a single but quite elegant word: fuck. After a while, we started talking about it. We came up with a conclusion that either somebody was having fun at our expense, or somebody got really hurt. At the end, we decided to head back there the first thing in the morning. But surprise, surprise, no signs of anyone being injured or anyone struggling. We decided that it was just someone playing pranks on us. However, to this day it keeps gnawing at me. Something just doesn't add up. We were standing there for quite some time, so the person must have been very well hidden. On the other hand, it would be almost impossible for anyone to just walk in there without any kind of light since it was so dark. And even if he had some kind of torch, we would certainly spot him. Anyway, screaming man in the forest, let's not meet. Hey! If you're a fan of the MrSleepy channel, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the weekly uploads. Number 3. Followed at 11 p.m. A few weeks ago, I was coming back home around 11:30 p.m. I have to cross a bridge in order to do so. Naturally, around this time there's close to no one crossing it. I am always very cautious of my surroundings. Small girl here, but we all have to keep an eye out just in case. And whenever I'm walking at night, I check if there's people walking behind me, how many men/women, and make a mental note on how close they are to me. As I started to cross the bridge, I checked. There was only one guy walking at a pretty decent distance. I kept walking normally. About a minute later, I get that feeling of someone looking at you and getting close, so I turn to check one more time. Now there's another guy behind and closer to me than I'd like at that time of the night, being by myself. I started to pick up my pace just to be cautious. As I'm about to finish the bridge, I still feel him walking very close, so I decided to go inside the convenience store that's right across the end of the bridge and spend a few minutes there. Until he is gone, I walk around for a while. After 3 to 5 minutes, I check the door and he's just outside the store, not doing anything, just standing there. I get kind of creeped out, decide to keep strolling around and buy some things. 10 minutes later, I decide it's time to go home since it's getting pretty late. But I still see him outside as soon as I get out. I stand there and do as if I was attending a call. He is looking at me and I really don't want to walk home by this time because it's a lonely road and well, it just does not feel like the smart thing to do. I hang up and just check my phone. He comes by and the convo goes like this. Him. Hi, how are you? Do you study here? Work? I study in this country. Clearly a foreigner. Me. Hi. Good. Yes, I do. Him. Good. Why did you choose to come here to study? Do you live close by? Me. I like it here. Yes, I do. Him. Good. Where do you study? Can I practice my English with you? Give me your ID number so we can meet and chat. This is to add me on the instant message app used here. Me. I'm terrible when it comes to saying no to people, even if feeling very uncomfortable. A bad trait, I know. Working on it. Completely ignores the where do I study question. Yeah, sure. Give him my ID. Well, I have to go. It's very late. Goodbye. Him. Adds me great. I look forward on seeing you again. Sure. Bye. As I turn around and slowly start walking to my house, I look back to see in which direction he is walking and see he is crossing the bridge. So he went out of his way to come and talk to me, the tiny girl, in the middle of the night. Now, I'm not saying his intentions were not genuine or he meant bad, but it was just very odd. I don't think it's the best idea to follow anyone so late at night and wait for them to be outside the nice, lit convenience store to ask for English practice or whatever it is they want. Would have been 10 times less creepy if he just came inside the store and did so. Any thoughts? I live in quite a safe country, but one must always be careful, huh? Take care, guys. Number 2. Creepy Victorian girl in the forest. I grew up in a small Scottish village with a population of around 100 people. The village has one shop, one pub, one park, a church, and a graveyard. Our house was even more remote and a 20-minute drive from the epicenter of village life. My weekly entertainment was my dad driving into the village every Saturday night to get shit-faced at the pub and me and my ADHD brother playing in the village forest down the road from this pub. Our dad would get us cans of Coke, which was the highlight, and we would run deep into this forest high on sugar, climbing trees, building huts, and just having a great time. We would stay until it was pitch dark and eventually drag our dad out of the pub. He would never come and retrieve us like he would this time. One night as we were playing deep in this forest, my leg got stuck in some deep, thick mud. It got jammed right up to my knee, and I couldn't pull it out, and neither could my big 8-year-old brother. I started to freak out and cry uncontrollably. I thought this was the end of me. I thought I would sink into the mud and never be found again. My crying freaked out my brother even more, so he ran back to the pub to get our old man. At this point, it was starting to get dark quite fast, and I was still alone with my legs stuck. We were more deep into this forest than usual, so I knew I was going to be alone for a good 15 to 20 minutes. Not a great situation to be in, I thought. As I was crying and waiting, in the corner of my eye, I saw someone run towards me. It wasn't from the direction of the pub, but from deep within the forest. I couldn't make out any major details initially, and the person was blurred. I was hoping my dad would turn up at this point, and this new person would promptly stop running towards me, but no. The person got closer into my field of vision, and I could make out more details. She was a girl and looked sort of around my age, 6 years old. I knew there was something strange about her, though, because she was wearing a dark gray 1800s Victorian dress, and I was certain now she was running straight towards me, getting closer with every step. She came up within 2 meters of me and stopped, my damn leg still stuck in the mud. Her eyes locked into mine. I said hello. No reply. No smile. Just stared deep into my eyes. "What's your name?" I asked her. Still no reply. Still, her black eyes locked. I didn't think she was a ghost or anything. She just dead-eyed stared at me for a very long time. She moved a little closer, not breaking eye contact. Time moved fast, and she simply turned around and sprinted back into the dark woods. Almost immediately after she ran off, my shit-faced dad stumbled into the forest, mumbling and swearing under his breath, with my brother following behind. I knew every single kid in that village and had never seen her before. The direction she came from and ran back into was just trees for miles, and nobody lived there. Her clothing was so weird compared to anything else I had ever seen. That forest was not the kind of place little girls would be running around, let alone late into the night. I definitely wouldn't have played in there at night if I didn't have my big brother. I never saw her again in the village or in the forest, but would have loved to know who she was. She was definitely human in my opinion, just a very strange human who was drawn towards my loud crying and distress. Number 1. This happened in the early 90s. In high school, one of my best friends was a girl I'll call Susan. She lived with her mom and stepdad out in the middle of nowhere. Even though we were the same age, her parents treated her a lot differently than my parents treated me. For one thing, I was expected to go to driver's training and get a license and a job. I saved enough money working at a fast food job that my parents let me buy a used car. Nothing fancy. I was expected to pay for all of the expenses for it. Susan's parents felt I was a bad influence on her because of my job and my car. Susan wasn't allowed to take her driver's training or get a job. After we graduated from high school, I joined the military and I lost touch with Susan. In the early 90s, living on my own, my parents called me at work one day and passed along a message that Susan had called and wanted to see me. I was really excited to see her. I loved her like a sister. She said she was staying with her mom and stepdad and asked if I remembered where they lived. Of course, I told her. We made arrangements for me to pick her up one night. She still didn't have a driver's license. We'd go to dinner and catch up. The night of our get-together, I drove to her childhood home. I went to the back door of a screened-in porch, and I couldn't help but be a little disturbed/puzzled at what I saw. Stuck to the ceiling were covers of dozens of paperback books. The books hung down from their covers on the ceiling all over the room. On the wall facing the door of the porch was a large picture of a half-man, half-goat. It held something in its hand, but I don't remember what. There were about 10 bowls of candles in them on the floor and on tables. I was taking in all of this when I heard Susan say, "Jane, come around here. We don't use that room anymore except for special purposes." I went around to the front door and she let me inside. There were 3 chairs set up facing the door and 3 people were sitting in the chairs. I recognized her mother as one of the people. Her stepfather, wearing nothing but an open bathrobe, was leaning to one side and drooling. There was another woman seated that I didn't recognize. No one introduced me to the other woman. I smiled and said hi to all of them. Susan stood off to the side of her half circle of seated people. None of them responded to my greeting. They just stared, unsmiling. No one said anything. They seemed to be evaluating me. I started to get frightened. I thought to myself, these people could murder me, and no one out here would hear a sound. I said to Susan, you ready to go?" She was ready, and we left without incident. We had a nice dinner and a nice visit. I asked her about the room and what it all meant, but she said she didn't want to talk about that. After dinner, I drove her home, but I didn't get out of the car. I couldn't get away fast enough. At work the next day, I was told I had a call from Susan, but it was Susan's mother, looking for her. I told her I didn't know where she was. Soon after, and unrelated to this, I moved to a different apartment in a nearby town and got a different job. I never saw Susan again. She reached out to me on some reunion website, but I never responded. I don't know if they were into devil worship or something else, but I was really frightened. For a couple of weeks after that, strange things happened. I would get phone calls where no one would say anything. I was driving along one day and a tire flew off of a car into the oncoming lane and crashed into the windshield of the car behind me. They were not injured. I really think it was all connected to the strange happenings in that house. An eerie encounter. I may not be any kind of expert, but I believe there's more to this world than we mere humans can hope to understand. I've always had a very fine-tuned sense for what I believe to be those unexplainable things, moments where I feel something, something I can't explain with any rationality. Later in life, I would be told to have what can most easily be explained as some kind of weak psychic or supernatural energy by a Wiccan witch. Nothing too impressive, but just enough to let me feel those entities even if I cannot see them. Like the ghost in my grandparents' guest room or the malicious entity haunting the stairs and basement garage. The same uncanny sixth sense that my mother observed when my younger brother was born. Stronger than her own maternal sense to the point I understood why my brother needed something before even he knew and could make a sound. Even waking moments before him in the middle of the night without fail. But I think there may be more to it than that, as this incident leads me to believe. My family had recently moved to British Columbia, Canada, that winter. I was 10 at the time. While we were by no means in the boonies, we moved into an older trailer near a well-known hiking trail and a small Christmas tree farm. Immediately, there was something off about the area. Something that my parents waved off as new home anxiety or just not being used to the place. I did my best to put it out of my mind. But within 2 weeks of the move, I began to notice strange happenings. Firstly, the unsettling aura I just couldn't shake. Sleepless nights, where I felt like I was being watched by something at my window. Strange shadows. There 1 second, gone the next. Voices. Soft. Whispering my name. And only when I was alone, and only in my room, near the window. However, whenever these incidents happened, soon after I would feel something brushing against my shins and ankles. Something that lessened the aura, at least for a while. These instances would be near constant until I stuck out on my own 8 years later. But it all came to a head that fall, months after the move. My parents insisted we take a family walk on the mountain trail, and though I didn't want to because I am by no means an outdoors man, something is screaming not to go, that it was dangerous. But, being barely 11, of course my parents completely dismissed my concerns as being lazy and we were off to the trail's main entrance. As soon as I set foot out of the car, the warning bells in my head were blaring louder. Something in me kept saying we had to leave, that something bad was going to happen. The little voice in my head kept focusing on my diabetic mom, who at the time had a weight problem, Dad with his disability that made him outright unable to run, that my bad lungs would make it impossible to run myself, that the three of us were sitting ducks. I don't know why I was so hyper-focused on running. We were halfway through the walk when suddenly I froze. The apprehension I had felt about the whole event ramped up to 11. My parents thought I stopped because I was tired, and took the opportunity to take pictures of the lovely fall leaves and dappled sunlight. It was a gorgeous sight, but I knew something was there, watching us, and it was not something we wanted to meet. I looked around, trying to find whatever was setting me off. All I saw was an occasional fleeting shadow. I could feel the brushing, but the feeling of dread and fear only got stronger. The familiar touch unable to drive it away as it normally would. Whatever it was close. If it came at us, we wouldn't stand a chance. And I still didn't know what the hell it was. My parents still hadn't noticed something was wrong. And I felt my voice catch in my throat, not out of fear, but as if something wasn't letting me speak. I heard the leaves rustle. It was close. So close. I glanced where the noise was coming from, and saw a shadow for a split second before it vanished behind a tree. And as it vanished, something changed. Hot. It felt like a volcano had erupted in my chest. Not like the slow, gentle ooze like one might see in Hawaii, but explosive, angry, spewing burning clouds of toxic gas and ash, spraying molten rock and fire. I was still afraid, but I wasn't frozen. I was angry, eyes locked on the area I'd seen the shadow. I was no stranger to anger. I am an aggressive woman and always have been, but this rage was entirely new. The feeling against my legs stopped, but the fire was burning hotter, and the dangerous thing hiding just outside my field of view, I felt it lock up in fear all its own. It felt like my body was controlled by something else. Still me, but different. I convinced my parents to pick up the pace, practically speed walking the rest of the loop, not daring to let the fire sparked in my chest die out until we were safely back at the car. The strange presence lingered, much further off but still watching, still malicious but almost curious now. We left the trail and never went back. A few weeks later, my mom found out she would be having my brother. As time passed, the whole incident kept nagging at my mind, and I found myself doing research from time to time to try and piece whatever happened together. And while I may never fully understand, I think I finally have part of an answer. I think I was protecting my brother. As I stated earlier, I have always had an unexplainable connection to him despite being so much older, and a terrifyingly vicious protective streak over him. When this happened, my mom would have been a month or so into her pregnancy. I think that whatever is in me that allows me to feel these presences so clearly, that was immediately focused on not me getting away, but my mom and dad with myself as the afterthought, knew he was there long before anyone else did. The phantom touches? As ridiculous as I feel saying it, I believed it was a guardian angel of sorts, or more accurately my protective, then long dead childhood cat keeps up his station even in death. The brushing feeling was identical to the feel of a cat weaving around your legs, and only stopped entirely when I moved out and got my own kitten, who just suddenly and uncharacteristically adopted the same guarding behavior. What was that thing? I believe it was a Wendigo or maybe a skinwalker, and I believe it had been hunting me and continued to hunt me since we moved to that town and until I moved away. The voices, the feeling of being watched, the fear of fire. I can't believe it was anything but. While I knew the creatures will stalk their desired prey for a long time, that thing always comes back whenever I visit my family. Regardless of what it is, Wendigo or otherwise, it's fixated on me. It seems I'm safe so long as I have this fire, at least from it. But I wonder why after so many years it still follows me whenever I enter what must be its territory, remembering that feeling of malice. Man in forest kills animals and chase after me while ringing bells in the dark. This is truly the scariest, most horrible thing that has ever happened to me. I have never been so petrified in my life. To this day, I still do not know who this man was, what he was trying to do, or if he is still where I saw him. I'm sorry for how long the geographical description is. I just want everyone to understand how secluded I was when this happened, and how badly it could have ended if it wasn't for my parents. I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting uni. Our home was, and still is, just outside of a small town with forests all around. There was also a small man-made lake, which was divulged from a river that ran for miles through the forest and ramified into a few streams east of the lake. Near my home, there was a small grassy path that led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a child. I knew the forests there well. I knew where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream. The walk I would go on always led me off the path, which turned northwest slowly, so away from the stream, and then took a sharp turn to the west after a few-mile walk, at which point the stream was hidden quite deep into the forest. I'd continue to walk north and follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in the forest because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water. It goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone or with my dad over the span of 18 years. Never saw anybody else in the forest. I went there twice that summer, both times alone-ish. The first time I left in the morning, I walked along the pathway from the stream to the sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. As I was running my hands in the water, I heard a bell from far away, coming from the north. Something was making a bell ring fervently and periodically, which I found strange. I listened well, wondering if it was a lost hunting dog, and started moving towards the sound. Yeah, I bloody know I'd be the first person to die, but I was heading north anyway, so what the hell. I realized it couldn't have been an animal. I could tell the bell was too heavy because of how clear the sound was to be on a collar. I kept moving, and the bell was moving away from me. It stopped completely after 5 minutes. The stream wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a ball. That could have been enclosed in a tin or something. And the river was far too still. I thought of everything, but nothing explained the sound, apart from one obvious thing, which I just didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to be a person. I stopped thinking about it and just walked on normally, until I found a badger. A bloomin' dead one, carefully decapitated. It had obviously been done with a knife. It was fairly fresh. The body was still limp, and there wasn't too much smell coming from it. The wound was full of maggots, but I knew that happened soon after exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream. So had I. So, the badger was put there, maybe killed there, at least decapitated, while I was walking that way, I suppose. Dunno really. Nothing else happened that day. 1 week later, I went back for the second time that summer and the last time ever. I left home around 6 p.m. I made it to the stream, then walked to the river in an hour, then decided to go back the way I came because it was getting late and it was raining quite heavily. The sun set around 9 p.m. I was walking as fast as I could. The sound of the rain in the trees was surreal and loud. I was somewhat trotting with my head down for a while through the clearest and most open part of the forest, when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickly. It was the decomposing body of the badger with his head strung to his front paws. That area looked a bit like a ham because of the way it was tied, just swinging from a tree, like an almost literal load of bullocks. It was this putrid bag of stench, wet and dripping green liquid. I started gagging. I had some sort of mucus-textured fluid in my hair. It was repulsive. At first I just stared at it, slightly gobsmacked. Then I started fidgeting violently because I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was soaking from the rain. My senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I walked the same way to get to the river, so someone had strung up the body up after I'd passed it on the way there. Someone knew I'd see it. So, was someone watching me and running around the forest? Were the faint sounds of branches breaking around me not animals? I looked around and started jogging. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back towards the path for a while when I heard the bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while running. I told him to meet me on the path where it sharply turns west. It was the closest part of the path to me, to go as fast as he could, and that someone was in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was like I just shat out my intestines and stomach. I literally felt the hairs on my neck raise despite being soaked. It was dark. I jogged as fast as I could. I was panicking because the path was still a bit far away, just too far to feel safe. It was still raining. Every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on for way longer than the last time. On and off. I felt like it was surrounding me at one point. The fear combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I couldn't flip and breathe properly was making me slightly lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I wasn't really sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a goddamn horse, coughing my lungs up, kind of crying out loud, like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mom, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mom was screaming on the phone at the same time that they were on the path, that I needed to run, that my dad had gotten out and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified, so I went into survival mode. I was doing the half running, half speed walking thing because I was out of breath. Then, I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down in the forest, and the bell ringing louder. I didn't want to, but I looked over my shoulder. That's when I saw it was in the forest with me. A tall figure creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing this bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. Now, I don't know if I had a hidden secret sprinting ability or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers, but when I tell you I ran for my life, I fucking didn't look back once. I screamed as much as I could. I lied. I'm on the phone with the police. They are on the path. Dad, I can see you. I'm here. I wanted to yell, Dad, please, where are you? But I kept that to myself. I felt like something awful was going to happen. I felt like the man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers on my neck, and then switched off. I just ran. I even dropped my bag and only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was in the car. I felt like my phone was the only way home. Things no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving by themselves. I don't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and the bell. I finally heard my dad shout my name, and I knew he was coming my way and that he could see me because of the intonation of his voice. I pretty much lunged myself at him when we got to each other. My dad heard the bell too. My mom could hear it on the phone. She was waiting with the car ready to leave fast. We went directly to the police station and I got medical attention soon after. My dad burst into tears in the car, said he could hear the bell, and thought he wouldn't be able to see me. Asked if I didn't have my phone, what if he couldn't pick up. They were almost as horrified as me because they witnessed everything through the call. They could hear me trying to run and they could hear the danger. They just couldn't see it. The police couldn't really do much. They searched the area and the only thing they found was a folded t-shirt placed under a rock. I didn't really question that at the time, and my bag was not recovered. They said it was probably some homeless man living in the forest, but failed to realize what could have happened if my dad didn't know that part of the forest like I did and where to find me. I'm not blaming anyone. The entire thing was my fault. There are just so many what-ifs. I want to believe it was just someone who decided to live in the woods and hunt or something. Maybe they were a bit mentally unstable and they felt angry that I came into their territory. But what if it was more insidious? The way he moved towards me was abnormal. It was perverse because how slowly he was ringing the bell. It's like he had me trapped. I didn't see any more detail. I just ran. To this day, I can't bloody go anywhere where I'll be alone, and the sound of bells is a real problem. The smell of moss as well. Anyway, my parents and Steve Jobs saved my life, so go hug yours now and take decapitated badgers and bells as pagan signs that you're unwelcome.
I awoke last Tuesday at 7:30 a.m. to the sounds of my clock radio. It's always been set to a local station. I just about lost my patience for national news a couple years back. Maybe it's something about getting old, but my world started to shrink when I hit 50, and I let it. I've never been one to lend an ear to world affairs, or any affairs outside of my home state of Massachusetts for that matter. I lived a quiet life as a fisherman at the docks in town, spending weeks at a time out at sea every year. All around, I've spent every calendar day at sea at some point in my life, even Christmas. I've even seen storms so fearsome that the pounding rain turned to bitter snow in front of my very eyes, a rarity at sea. I've felt waves so large that they even keep me awake now, 20-odd years later. Right as I'm on the precipice of sleep, they threaten to pull me back to consciousness, just as they almost pulled me out into sea. Forgive an old man and his ramblings. But all of this to say that I thought I knew what to expect when I heard the radio newscaster say, "Batten down, folks. Another winter storm coming later this week." As I wiped the sleep from my eyes, I half listened to the newswoman's lengthy list of preparation tips before smacking off the button and swinging my legs over to the side of the bed, joints and floorboards creaking in unison. That was 8 days ago. Every day leading up to the storm, I've woken to broadcasts about its effects, and every day the messaging has become less and less clear. Wednesday, it was the winter storm Riley will cause even more damage than last week's storm. Thursday, it was cancel all your plans for Friday and Saturday, folks. The state advises all residents to stay in their homes until after the storm. Friday morning, I woke up with a jolt to the grating beeps of the statewide emergency alert system. I turned on my TV, which can usually be relied on to get at least a few channels. Not Friday, though. Friday, every screen was blank except for a red banner at the bottom with the words, "State of Emergency declared for a coastal region of southern Massachusetts. Do not attempt to flee your homes," moving across repeatedly, all while accompanied by that same grating 3-beep cycle. My stomach fluttered with uneasiness as I read the message for the second time and fully grasped the choice of words. Flee? Why would a whole town flee at the thought of some wind and snow? We're northeasterns ourselves, after all. I put my robe on and made my way down the stairs to my back door, expecting the fearsome gales and pelting snow that I had come to expect from the life at sea. I opened the door to eerie, permeating quiet. The coastline cacophony that served as a constant background for my life here, the screaming of gulls, the crashing of waves, and the howling of the wind, it was all utterly gone, and in its place was a silence so complete that it caused the back of my neck to prickle with a deep and foreboding sense of wrong. The sky was devoid of the heavy, foreboding gray clouds that the newscasters had promised, instead featuring a consistent blanket of greenish-gray fog high above the sea. I hurriedly closed the door, amplifying the distant sound of the 3 blaring beeps from my TV upstairs. I put a kettle of water on the stove before heading upstairs to get dressed, the uneasiness in my gut turning into an incessant gnawing as I turned to switch off the TV. The emergency alert at the bottom of the screen had changed to a "Do not leave your home," plastered 4 times. Underneath my feet, the kettle began to shriek as the beeping of the television reached a heightened pitch. Do not leave your home. 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 The television screen turned black with a pop, shutting down in coordination with my lights. A few seconds later, a sound with twice the force of a foghorn blast and the same thunderous intensity as a train blasting past roared over my head from the sea towards the mainland. A flash of green lit up the dim sky, for a second illuminating the same utter stillness from before. I waited in my house for 38 minutes before the noise and rumbling came thundering past from town back towards the sea. That was 5 days ago. The power came back on as soon as the noise was gone, as did the howl of the wind and crashing of the waves. But it's what happened during those 38 minutes that has caused the gnawing in my gut to persist. They're saying the power outages were caused by heavy winds, but I don't buy it. I saw photos of the storm online, complete with heavy snow and wind-battered houses. That might be from some other town, but it sure as hell isn't from mine. We have no coastal flooding, no infrastructural damage, or houses blown out to sea. What we have is thousands and thousands of dead birds. We have water that tastes like copper. We have bloated fish carcasses washing up on our beaches. I'm writing this today as a warning. I don't know what the hell happened last week, but it sure as hell isn't what they said it was going to be. If you're in the Northeast, take special care, and if they tell you not to leave your homes, you do well to listen. Today I woke up at 7:30 a.m. to the words of Winter Storm Quinn, set to break later this afternoon, expected to cause even more damage than Riley.
I went to a canoe tripping camp or canoe camping in northern Canada while I was growing up. When I was there, the camp was already 102 years old. In the early years of the camp, they had First Nation, Cree, and Ojibwe guides on the trip. In the early 1910s, they had a very popular and good guide who had just gotten married. He moved his wife out to a remote island on one of the lakes and built a cabin with her out there. There were a few other cabins on the lake, but it was quite remote considering it was on a fur trading route. They had a happy first winter, but he was gone all summer guiding canoe trips, and during the fall and spring he would be gone for weeks at a time trapping animals for furs, only coming home to the remote cabin to get different clothes and drop off supplies to his young wife. One trip early in the fall, he came home to drop off supplies, and his wife had lost her mind, and she killed him by chopping him in the head with an axe. They found her screaming, stark mad and naked, on the shore of their island. She was committed and died shortly afterwards. She never recovered her mind. In the late 1990s and the early fall, a husband and wife were canoe tripping down that same lake and were caught in a terrible storm. They took shelter on the island. They tried to set up their own tent, but it was torn away by the wind. The guide's cabin still stood. The years had blown out the windows and collapsed part of the roof, but it was shelter enough from the storm. They hunkered down there that day and into the night as the storm raged on. The next morning, the wife was found naked and screaming for help, adrift in their canoe on the lake. The waters were still rough from the storm the day before, and she was inconsolable. She claimed a native man with a half head tore her clothes from her as she slept, and that she was chased by a naked corpse of a woman into the night until she escaped in their canoe. She didn't know where her husband was. They found his body in the ruins of the cabin, with half his head missing. They never solved the murder. When I was younger, I lived on an estate of houses that backed onto a huge field where many people walked their dogs. It was even used as a cut-through to the next neighborhood, which would take approximately 25 minutes to walk through. When I was about 13, my neighbor and I decided to camp out for the night in my back garden, which apart from a 6-foot wooden fence was completely open to the field, albeit with 20 trees around the fence. Seeing as we were into Action Man figures at the time, we decided we would make the tent a hideout, so we got together some branches and one of those army nets to put over the tent to make it a bit stealthier. We also put the tent in the corner of the back garden, which had a small roof over it, which made it very dark once the sun went down. We did the usual thing, ate loads of chips and candy before we decided to try and get some sleep in our well-hidden, super dark tent. On 4 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone landing and then walking on small stones. I then realized that below the fence, my mom and dad had decorated with some gravel and flower pots. At first, I thought it was our cat, but it was far too loud to be such a small animal. I slowly sat up, trying not to make too much noise for my sleeping bag. Then I heard it again. I once again tried to make my way to the front of the tent silently and looked through the zipper. About 10 feet away from us, there were two guys dressed in all black crouching under the windowsill of the kitchen talking to each other. I immediately froze and had no idea what to do. They proceeded to creep closer to us, looking for more windows or maybe an entrance. Because we were in the corner of the garden, we were quite close to the path that led down the side of our house, where there was a door into the adjoined garage. I heard them talking quite clearly, as now they were less than 5 feet away from me and my friend, who was still asleep. They were talking about being unseen and just taking whatever they could find in the garage instead of breaking into the house and disturbing anyone. I had no idea what to do, so I rang the house phone, which was pretty loud, and waited for someone to answer. It took a while, as it was very early. As soon as the phone rang, two people bolted to the fence and hopped over. My dad then answered, and I whispered for him to get outside ASAP with a bat or something. Nothing happened in the end, but I'm glad my friends left silently.
Me and my friends saw a full-body apparition similar to the Grim Reaper that we named Danny. Danny appeared on our neighborhood street in November 2010. I was 10 years old. My brother was 8. And my other friends were 9 and 12. We were riding our bikes up and down the street, enjoying our last minutes of daylight, when we spotted what appeared to be a black, cloaked figure pacing back and forth across the road. At first it was hunched over and we thought it was an animal, but you could tell it was wearing a cloak by the way the fabric moved as it walked. We watched as a car passed by it. As soon as the car headlights touched the figure, sprang to the side of the road and sat there in the darkness, stooping low to the ground. Then resumed its pacing when the car was gone. We were both frightened and curious. I ran to my mom about the mysterious stranger, and she came out and looked down the road and told us she didn't see anything. This only made us more determined to find out what was going on. We hopped on our bikes and went to check it out. Kaylee, the oldest, went first, with us younger kids trailing behind her just in case it would start chasing us. I don't remember my thoughts as we approached it. I was more fascinated than scared. I didn't believe in ghosts and was counting on my older friend to protect us. When we were about 5 feet from it, we stopped. By now it had paused its relentless pacing and was standing silently in the middle of the road, watching us. It was a man, about 5'5", dressed in a floor-length black cloak with a hood. The sleeves of the cloak were long and hid his hands, and his face was hidden in the darkness of the hood. He looked like the Grim Reaper without a scythe. At first the thought crossed my mind that he was one of the neighbors. Halloween was a month ago, and what neighbor would still be outside on a chilly November evening pacing across the road? And besides, there was something off about the man that I couldn't place. Something inhuman. He wasn't see-through like you would think a ghost would be. He was solid and appeared almost as a real person, except that there was something about the way he stood silently in the road staring at us. Something in the way he moved made it obvious that he wasn't a part of this world. Kaylee stepped forward. "Who are you?" she asked. The man did not reply, but his head shifted towards her slightly, and it was obvious he was aware of us. Then his whole body shifted as if he was going to walk forward, and Kaylee turned her bike around, screamed at us to run, and began pedaling away at top speed. I instantly fled back up the street towards home, too scared to notice if it was chasing us. Kaylee was a rational kid for her age. She never got scared of anything, but as she ran past me, I saw her look back at the man, and she had an expression of terror on her face. Once we reached home, we looked back to see if it had followed us, but it had vanished. We didn't go back outside that night and walked each other home. Years later, there are so many unanswered questions that me and my friends still discuss. Who was he? Where did he come from? Our neighborhood was surrounded by a forest and a metal fence, and there was only one entrance. And we had been playing in the street all day and hadn't seen any strangers pass through. Why wasn't my mom able to see it? We have nicknamed the encounter Danny, because when we talk about the incident, people think we are crazy if we say ghost or shadow man. Indeed, if I myself had seen Danny alone, I would have written it off as my imagination. But the fact that 3 other people saw it at the same time, including Kaylee, who used to make fun of people who believed in the paranormal, is proof to me that we didn't just make it up. At night, the memory of Danny and his cloak makes me shiver, and I lie awake and think how I am probably one of the only people on this planet who knows 100% that the supernatural is real, because we stood in front of it and spoke to something that was not only present in our reality, but aware of us. I wish I had proof, a video or a photo, but it was 2010 and we were kids who didn't have cameras or iPhones. I am not even sure if other people could see it. No other neighbor reported anything strange, and my mother still claims to this day that she saw nothing when she looked down the road. I have 2 theories: that Danny was indeed the angel of death as described in the Bible, walking the earth to claim lost souls, and that Danny was a demon or lost soul himself, who had been summoned by a cult into our reality, and had been trapped in the physical world. Our neighborhood, Long Branch, Washington, had been lawless up until 1918, and was famous for its cults and shady characters, especially in the 70s. People who were in trouble with the law often lived there in secrecy and isolation. After we saw Danny, a neighbor killed himself and his body wasn't discovered until a week later, and another was brutally beaten to death with a chair while he lay in a coma at a local hospital. My guess is that someone messed with something they didn't understand. And the result was Danny, left to wander the dark woods forever, cursing the neighborhood with his presence. We haven't seen him since. Although odd deaths continue to plague our old neighborhood, I will never touch a Ouija board, or even hold tarot cards because of what happened. For me, the supernatural is too real and too close, and not something I want to ever experience again. Does anyone have an explanation for these strange occurrences? A few years ago, my best friend died. We were on bad terms at the time. I didn't realize it at the time, but his disease had taken his mind. Apparently on his deathbed, he was hallucinating and laughing and talking to me like I was in the room. About a year later, I had a dream he called me on the phone. It was so realistic. We were catching up on my past year and joking around. I suddenly realized and asked, "Hey, aren't you dead?" There was this loud screech on the phone and I woke up. I knew I was dreaming, but it felt so real. When I was 20 years old, I went to my bathroom. It was the middle of the day. I turned to look at the mirror, but my reflection turned its back. I was facing the mirror wall, looking at the back of my head. I was so confused and startled that I left and was afraid to look at a mirror for the rest of the day. No psych history, no drugs or alcohol. I have no explanation. Throughout my lifetime, I have heard 3 knocks on the door or wall. It's not a common occurrence, usually late at night or early in the morning. I'm wide awake when it happens. When I investigated, I found nothing, no clue. When I was in my early 20s, I was trying to sleep on the couch with my girlfriend at her parents' house. I was nowhere near tired. I had my eyes closed and had the overwhelming sensation someone was standing over me. It was intense. I figured it was one of her parents. I turned my head and opened my eyes, and there was this old woman whom I've never seen before. She looked about 80 years old. My heart dropped, and the old woman looked shocked as she ducked beneath the couch. I sat up and reached over the couch to find nothing. I was camping with a buddy in the high Sierras by a lake. I was trying to sleep on bare ground with my head uphill. Bright full moon so you could see without a flashlight. I had this faint pulsing sensation starting at my head, move down to my left, and stop at my feet. Now it was intense. I was convinced nothing was there, but would sit up to look and put my mind at ease. I did, and there was a huge mule deer with a giant rack right at my feet. I screamed, "Oh shit," and the deer stood on his hind legs and ran off. Freaked me out that something was actually there. I think I am being followed by a ghost/spirit. Help. My mother died when I was 9 in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. Me and my older sister Kay moved in with my father, and my 2 younger sisters moved in with my stepfather. I want to start this by saying I truly don't believe it's my mother that is doing the haunting, and this is all caused by my own stupidity, but now I don't know what to do. When I was a senior in high school, we moved into a tiny 3-bedroom house. It had a creepy basement with no outside entrance, but on the outside of the door was a chain lock right above the doorknob, which made no sense. Right off the basement door was the back porch where you would head through to get to my bedroom, and then you would walk through my bedroom to get into my sister's room. My cat, who is more obsessed with my sister than me, refused to go into my sister's room. She would hiss and freak out every time I tried to walk her towards the back of the house. Once, one of my friends brought over their dog, and I put my cat in my room for safekeeping. I went back there, and 15 minutes later, after they left, and the whole room was a mess from her running around, and there was piss and shit everywhere. She had never done anything like that before. There was another time when I was lying in my room and my sister was lying in hers, and the door between the rooms was slammed shut. She threw open the door and started yelling at me about shutting the room off. When she saw my face, she realized it wasn't me. I slept on the couch, and she slept at her boyfriend's house and basically moved in with him after that. In a moment of divine teenage stupidity, my friends and I decided to use an Ouija board. We only used it for a moment or two. We opened the board, got freaked out because we felt like we were being watched, closed it off and put it away. It wasn't a week later that the basement door chain was ripped off and there was gouge marks on the door. A week after that, I went into my sister's room to grab something to take to her, and the room was covered in gnats. I couldn't find anything that would cause it. Family issues led me to moving in with my stepfather and little sisters right after. It was only a 2-bedroom house, so I slept in the basement in a little nook, and my sister, P, slept on the other side. I would often hear the sounds of footsteps stomping overhead even if I was the only one home. I saw a shadowy figure standing at my dresser that would disappear after I turned the light on. One night after a bonfire, my friend stayed the night. I sat up in bed because someone was standing at the entrance to my little nook. They were dark and I couldn't make out any features. I watched them for a few moments, but they didn't do anything, so I shook her awake. She asked who they were and tried to talk to them, but they didn't respond. So getting freaked out, she turned on the light, and the moment she did, they were gone. We walked upstairs to find it was almost 4 a.m. and that everyone was sleeping. Needless to say, we slept on the couch that night, and I slept on it pretty often after that. Not long after I graduated, moved into an apartment with my now husband, B, and became pregnant. We would hear doors shutting, which isn't super strange because we lived in an apartment, so obviously you can hear your neighbors. Sometimes I could hear whistling at the back of the apartment, and sometimes I would hear my daughter giggle over the baby monitor when she was learning to talk and talking to someone she called Nana. Once, our burner turned on and burnt breakfast leftovers that had been sitting in a pan. I knew it wasn't us, because we had breakfast at 7 and it was 11 a.m. by the time we realized something was burning. It was turned on all the way. We bought a new house around the time my daughter turned 3, and everything was fine for 2 years, but I recently just had a new baby and things have getting weird again. The first thing I noticed was my first day home alone with the baby. I was sitting on the couch singing to her, and right above me I heard stomping like someone was walking through my attic. Obviously, there's no one up there, so I brushed it off to sleep deprivation. But now my daughter's 4 months old and sleeps way better through the night, so I know I'm not tired. I often hear the sound of doors shutting and toys going off when I'm the only one home with the baby. My dog always runs to check out the noise, so I know it's not just me hearing things. I have stepped outside to have the door shut randomly behind me when the girls are napping. We've had cups fall and break out of the cabinet in the middle of the night. My husband works out of town a lot, so I'm alone at night with the girls and often get the feeling that I'm being watched. I sleep with a pocket knife next to my bed. A family was murdered the night I gave birth to my daughter, like 4 houses down. So that's not too crazy, in my opinion. But what drove me to post this is last night I woke up from a dead sleep because I heard my baby crying. It was followed by a soft hello and shushing noise, to which my baby calmed. I relaxed for a second, thinking my husband was taking care of it, but I felt him shift behind me. I have never bolted out of bed and grabbed that knife so quickly in my life. I threw my door open and my dog was sitting outside of the baby's room, watching the door. The baby was awake in her bedroom, by herself. Her cheeks were still wet from tears, but her pacifier was in her mouth and she was just looking around. She's 4 months. She can't put a pacifier back in her mouth after crying. I checked the house. It was all clear. I didn't sleep the rest of the night and spent it scrolling the internet to find out if anyone else has had this problem. No, my husband doesn't believe anything's happening. He doesn't believe in this kind of stuff. He thinks there was an interference over the baby monitor. It still doesn't explain the pacifier or the stomping or the doors being shut. I just don't know what I should do. Whatever it is doesn't seem to know if it wants to burn my house down or nanny my kids. Or maybe it wants us gone from the picture to have the girls to itself. I don't know what to do or what to think. I'm almost 26 now, and this all started when I was 18. Any advice or help would be so amazing and I would be so grateful. I really do not know what to do. The Man in the Yellow Raincoat. So this is a story that happened to my mom's friend in Korea about like 10 years ago. Every time I hear this story, I still get the chills. My mom's friend lived in an apartment complex in Seoul. She was a stay-at-home mother with a young daughter, and her husband worked during the days. One day, she was coming home from running errands with her daughter and got onto the elevator in her building. When she got on, she noticed that there was a man wearing a cap and a yellow raincoat, and he kept his head low so that she really couldn't see his face. She immediately felt really uneasy, and she made her daughter stand by her side, furthest away from the man. What made her feel even more uncomfortable was that when she passed the button for her floor, there was no other lit number, and on top of that, she noticed that he was carrying something wrapped inside newspaper close to his side. Things started to click in my mom's friend's head, and she started to panic and decided to take out her cell phone and pretend she was calling home to her husband, who was obviously really not at home and at work. She started saying things like, "Oh, I'm on the elevator and about to get off. Can you open the door for me?" and making it seem like her husband was waiting at home. When the elevator did reach her floor, I think she lived on like the 12th floor or something, she quickly got off and grabbed her daughter and started walking as fast as she could to her apartment. She noticed that the man also got off on her floor and was slowly following her down the hallway. When my mom's friend got to her door, she started to bang on it and shout, "Hey, Yibu, husband/dear, I'm home. Please open the door," and kind of pretended like he was coming to answer the door. Upon seeing this, the man in yellow raincoat started to walk away backwards towards the elevator. When he seemed to be far away enough, my friend's mom quickly picked up her daughter and slid open her door's passcode thingy. This is usually how people get into their homes in Korea, and started to frantically punch in her key code. But the problem was that the buttons would make sounds, so the man knew that no one was going to answer the door for her, and he turned around and started running back towards her. My mom's friend, at this point, was practically screaming, and when she finally got her door to open, the first thing she did was throw her daughter in through the door. When she got in herself, she saw that the man was pretty much inches from the door, but she managed to shut it and lock it before he could wedge his hand or weapon into the door. Afterwards, looking through the door's peephole, she saw that the man was walking away back towards the elevator. Several months later, my mom's friend was watching the news, and there was a coverage on the capture of a serial killer named Yu Young-chul who used to kill a lot of prostitutes. She told my mom that she could never forget the dread she felt when she saw the two familiar raincoat and hat that he was wearing when apprehended. The dog in the road. This particular event happened almost a year ago, sometime in mid-October. A couple friends and I drove to visit an old friend of ours from high school, George, who now lived about an hour out of the city. We spent the whole day with him, and it was really late when we finally decided to start the drive back home. My friend Lisa was passed out in the passenger seat. She had had a few drinks and decided to spend the ride home asleep. My other friend Sam was sitting in the back seat behind Lisa and was playing a game on her smartphone. I, of course, was driving. I was following the GPS's instructions back to the freeway. At that moment, we were driving down a dark street with thick trees bordering both sides. Everything was pretty peaceful, with the only sounds I could hear being that of the car moving along the road and the radio on low volume. Suddenly, my car let out a loud jolt, and it felt as if I had hit something. Sam let out a shocked scream while Lisa remained dead asleep. I slammed on the brakes and the car came to a halt. I was breathing heavily when I asked what the hell had just happened. Sam peered through the back window and gasped. She turned to me with an angry look on her face and shouted that I had just hit a dog. I looked through the back window and, sure enough, a dog was lying in the road a few yards behind the car. Sam is a pretty big animal lover, so I wasn't surprised to see her get pissed at me. She was about to open her door and rush to the animal's aid when I stopped her. Once I had gotten over the shock of running over a dog, I got a feeling in my gut that told me that something was off. I'm not a braggart, but I consider myself to be a very attentive and safe driver. My eyes were on the road at all times, and I distinctly remember not seeing any dog in the road prior to the car jolting. Yes, it was dark, but I was sure that I would have at least seen the dog in the headlights before hitting it. I looked through the back window and took a closer look at the dog, or at least as much as I could make out in the reddish light coming from my taillights. It was a fairly big dog, at least a golden retriever or something like that. One particular detail caught my attention. I could see the dog's tail wagging. Now, I'm no expert on the mannerisms of an animal, but I was sure the last thing a dog would be doing after being hit by a car would be to wag its tail. After a moment of thought, I pressed my foot down on the accelerator and sped off. Sam snapped at me and ordered me to go back, but I told her that something was wrong with the whole situation. She continued to argue, but she fell silent as she turned back towards the back window. She asked, "What the heck?" in a shaken voice. I looked in the rearview mirror. Though it was dark, I was able to make out the silhouettes of 3 large figures emerging from the trees on the side of the road. The dog was now up on its feet and jumping around joyfully. The 3 figures looked in our direction as I pressed my foot down on the gas harder and sped off. Sam and I remained silent for the rest of the ride home. It wasn't until a few days later we told Lisa about it. We've been back to visit George a few times since, but we always make sure to leave before sunset. Still, I dread to think about what would have happened if we had gotten out of the car. Night vision. It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday, and he'd left them at my apartment. One night I was bored and decided to go try out the goggles at a wooded hiking/nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a really stupid idea since I was all by myself and female. But I was young and stupid, and I got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing deer and other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before, and we'd never run into anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign parking closes at 10, and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I found a place to sit down, so I lit my way with a mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard a little rustling in the woods a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I put it down to animal activity. Hopefully the deer I'd come hoping to see. After I had hiked in a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch darkness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while, I had a blast looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer, though, and I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me. Darkness or no, if I sat right out in the open on a log, so I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for my deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, lit up in bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting, was a man, dressed head to toe in dark-colored clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the same direction I'd come and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree and glancing around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. Wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve where hunting of any kind is prohibited. And at any rate, the guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There were no deer in sight, and very few hunters kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation. A young woman alone, weaponless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so no cell phones, and even if I had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it lest I draw his attention. I didn't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had just adjusted, and I was terrified he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who, or whatever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around but couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I heard in the woods when I first arrived, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I had been annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car had passed me and driven on its way, and I hadn't thought anything more of it. Now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car, if he'd circled back and seen my parked car, alone in the lot, if he'd come in after me. I sat, paralyzed with fear, and watched the man for what felt like forever but was probably another half hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree and I was sure he was going to look up and find me. But he didn't. After a while he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind. I heard him say, "Fuck it," and he started heading back in the direction he'd come. The direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying, until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down and, still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain, I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped all down the sides of the car with something sharp. Presumably, a giant knife that I'm lucky it didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for the night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me. And thank God for big trees with steady branches. Creepy forest rapists, let's never meet again. Violin Hill. Around 2 years ago, I finally moved into a brand new house in a brand new building estate in Australia. I was one of the first to have a finished building in the area and was elated to finally gain independence. The first few weeks went by as normal, and during that time, I'd often take walks alone with the dog in the afternoons and roam the surrounding estate area. All the roads around us had been partially completed and all the other properties were marked out, but no other houses were built excluding one that was directly opposite of mine. The house looked finished, but there was no driveway laid yet, and from what I could gather, no one lived there. To the left of my house, roughly a few hundred meters away, was a field with a huge hill in it. I later found out that the whole area was council property. Not only was no one allowed to build up there, but the whole hill was basically a no-go zone. For whatever reason, the council just didn't want people on it, so the whole area was surrounded by a huge chain-link fence. The only other noticeable feature in the area was a small abandoned farmhouse with a shed a few kilometers down the road. I knew nothing about it and often went walking there with the dog, as it gave me something mild to explore amongst the vast nothingness I was living around. The entire place was dilapidated and completely inhabitable. A month or two after moving in, I awoke one morning to the sound of a violin. It sounded extremely distant and quite haunting. I actually enjoyed it and assumed that the neighbors opposite of me has finally moved in. Excited that I finally had some people to talk to, I peeked out of the curtain and saw the house opposite mine was still as vacant as it ever was. I got dressed, but by the time I managed to look outside, the violin has stopped. This happened roughly every second day for the next week. The violin would wake me up and then disappear after about 45 seconds. I'd ignore it to the point where curiosity simply got the better of me, and the next morning when I heard the violin playing again, I immediately jumped out of bed, threw on my dressing gown, and shot out of the front door. I scoured the early morning surrounding, and there, up on the hill, was a figure playing a violin. It was barely light, but the person looked very tall from the distance I was at, and as they were playing, was doing what could only be described as a waltz-type walk, spinning slowly around in a circle as they played. I took my eyes off the person and walked over to pick up the morning paper, and in the 10 seconds that took me, I heard the violin stop. When I looked up, I noticed the figure was no longer playing or dancing, but was now standing still and most likely looking in my direction. It was so dark that I couldn't make out and more, and we both just stood there for half a minute, not moving before the creeps got the better of me and I went back inside. After that morning, things started happening. On my walks, I began to notice footprints on the surrounding properties that weren't made by me that I'd never seen before, which I just assumed were from people walking up from the other housing areas down the road. I never awoke to the violin, but I swear I could hear someone walking on the street next to my bedroom window in the early mornings. However, I never saw anything. Other really general things as well, like random tools such as spades and rakes laying around the area, which I guessed were left there by construction crews, none of which I ever saw. I had started getting calls at work that would immediately hang up on me, and I never stopped waking up to the abandoned farmhouse, as the experience with the violin player had me a little shaken. One night as I was heading to bed, I turned off the television in the living room and, again, could hear the faint sound of a violin playing. However, it sounded more muffled and rehearsed. I froze and a cold chill flowed through me instantaneously, considering that it was about midnight and not the usual time I'd hear it playing. I went to the front window and peeked out to see there was a light in the house opposite mine. It was clearly a candle, as I could see the dim light flicker in the empty window, and the music sounded like it was coming from an old record player. But in the 10 minutes I watched, I never saw any movement inside the house. I moved away from the window, sufficiently freaked out, and after another 5 minutes, I heard the music abruptly stop. I peeked out again to notice the light was now out. I never saw anyone. I began to become unsettled in the house and would often invite friends over to hang out until late. But of course nothing would ever happen when someone else was with me. I never bothered to tell any of my friends, as without evidence, I figured they'd just give me shit about it and I'd just become more agitated. But nothing compared to what happened next. In my living area, the desk sits right next to a small window which looks out to the fence surrounding my property. The steel fence is literally an arm's length from the house and about 6 feet tall, so I always figured that, unlike most of the other windows, I'd never need to cover this one with a sheet or blanket because no one could ever see in. I usually had headphones on when I played, and I always had the lights off, for no other reason than I preferred to play games in the dark. One night when I was gaming, I got up and walked into the dark kitchen and got a beer out of the fridge. It was dead silent, excluding the faint sound coming out of my headphones. As I closed the fridge and turned around to face the desk, I saw directly out the window 2 very, very faint lights. I didn't even catch on and immediately started walking back to the desk, fixated on the small glowing balls, and it wasn't until I had my nose almost pressed against the glass that I realized 2 lights weren't lights at all. They were eyes. A set of eyes, sitting just above the fence line, staring wide open at me. They didn't blink. They didn't move. My entire body locked up. All I could do was simply stare back, as my brain was still comprehending that there was an actual person looking at me in the scariest way I could possibly ever imagine. I don't know what happened. Either my head kicked into gear or my muscles loosened, but my body automatically collapsed and I fell to the floor, scurrying to hide against the wall away from the window. I could hear my heart beating through the carpet like a drum as I tried to lay as flat as possible, and as my mind was still processing the sheer severity of the situation, a violin started playing. The fucking violin and the haunting tune it always emitted started up, except this time it was directly outside my window and much louder than I'd ever heard it before. The lights were still off, and I wanted to get up to turn off the PC screen so I couldn't be seen. But my whole body just wasn't ready to cooperate. Not only was the sound of the instrument extraordinarily loud, but it sounded like it was being played with frustration, notes been missed frequently, and the strings screeching. The pace of it was getting faster and faster, and by this time, my dog Jeb out in the backyard had picked up on the situation and, registering an unfamiliar sound, gave one solitary, deep bark. The violin instantly stopped, and the house was finally dead silent, excluding my headphones, which I could hear quietly working away. I was still frozen to the carpet, and it wasn't until Jeb gave a second menacing bark that I heard the figure outside the window start to walk away in the direction of my yard. Once the first footstep hit the ground, I instantly thought of the welfare of my best mate, and finally, my head connected with my extremities and my entire body kicked into overdrive. I leapt from the ground and slid across the laminated floor to the back door where Jeb was standing, staring into the backyard. I ducked to keep low and quietly unlocked and slid open the door. Usually doing so would notify Jeb that he was allowed inside, but when the door opened up, he didn't move an inch and was completely fixated on the pitch-black backyard. Everything told me not to go outside, but there was no chance I was letting anything happen to my dog, and I moved on to the alfresco, moved behind Jeb, put my hand under his collar, and attempted to back him towards the house. Jeb is a pure Labrador and weighs like a sack of sand, so when he doesn't want to move, it'll take a sheer force to pull him in the direction you want him to go, and right now, Jeb wasn't going anywhere. I yanked at his scruff, and as I did, he emitted a bark like I've never heard before. A deep, bellowing, fuck you right off sound that elevated my nerves to an all-time high. We both just stood there, waiting for some form of reply, and I couldn't remember how long we both just froze there. But eventually, I heard footsteps from around the side of the house begin to walk away, but not a simple walk. Almost like whoever was doing it was slowly dancing in a circle, the footsteps keeping to a beat as they drifted away from the house into the distance. Once I couldn't hear anything, Jeb licked his lips, gave me a look, and wandered back inside. I followed, locked the door behind me, and spent the night reverting back to my childlike self, hiding under my bed covers with my dog. I didn't sleep a wink. That was the last time I ever saw or heard the violin player. The following morning, when the sun finally came up, I called to work sick and called the police. They scoured the lot next to mine and found footprints in the dirt. However, there were so many there that it was impossible to tell whose were whose. The only description I could give to the officer was his height. He would have had to be over 6 feet to stare over that fence at me, but they explained that he could have been standing on something, or on his toes. They also told me that they've never received a report of anyone playing a violin in the area or anyone been in the fenced-off hill either. I essentially looked like an insane person, but the officers were very nice about the whole thing and offered to patrol the area for the next few nights, which helped put my mind at ease. Nothing else has happened since then. Over the next year or two, people finally started moving in, and I tell them all the story about the figure I saw, some of which still used to keep their children in line, which I found funny. One guy nicknamed the council lot Violin Hill, and the name has stuck around our street since then. I even spent a period of time scouring the depths of the internet for that violin tune I kept hearing, but could never find it. There were a few classical pieces that seemed reminiscent, but I've since thought that whatever tune was played must have been self-composed, which creeps me out even more. I'm still in the house. I still tell people the story, and I haven't changed my routine one bit, which has really helped me block out the fear of the experience. I game with the blinds closed now. Out of gas. I grew up in an extremely rural Midwestern state. My family lived in the country between two small towns. I had attended school in both towns and knew most of the families in the area either by face or last name. One night, it was about 10 or 11, and I was leaving a high school basketball game in Town A. I was around 15 and driving on my school permit past curfew. I had borrowed my uncle's car, an early 90s Toyota with a leak in the gas tank that caused me to run out of gas before I made it more than 5 or 6 miles out of town, and I had about 7 left to go. I was on a long stretch of road that served as a shortcut between two main highways in the aforementioned town and wasn't heavily traveled. There were a few houses, but they were stretched far apart, and at the time, as well as to this day, cell phone reception was very spotty. I waited a while, and finally a nice, newer red truck with an extended cab, a toolbox in the back, and a construction company logo on the side pulled up. It was a Friday or Saturday night, and there was a man inside with a woman and 2 girls. He offered me his phone. I remember noticing it was a track phone, which my friends and I at the time referred to as crack phones because you can't trace the owners and they are frequently used by drug addicts. They're also used by a lot of people who can't afford a standard phone plan. But the family was driving a really nice car and they seemed super clean cut, so it struck me as odd. The phone got no reception. I tried calling my parents a few times and finally gave up. The truck had been headed away from Town B towards Town A, where I had just come from. So when they offered me a ride, I thought nothing of it. I had a gas can in the trunk and all my friends lived in Town A. So I figured they could drop me off at the gas station on the way to their destination and I could find a ride back with somebody I knew. When I got in the car, I was caught off guard by the way the woman, who I assumed was his wife, and the 2 girls, who I assume were their children, were dressed. Conservative families, even Amish and Mennonites aren't common where I'm from, but for the man being otherwise modern, wearing jeans, driving a sort of flashy truck, and owning a cell phone. The females' clothing surprised me. They all wore long, heavy skirts with button-up blouses and thin bonnets on their heads. One of the girls seemed to have a disability and made grunting noises every so often. Other than her noises, the women were completely silent. Everything seemed fine to me until the man driving turned around and started driving the opposite way of the direction he'd been driving. The closest town the other way was still 15 or so miles, and it seemed out of his way. Out of politeness, I reminded him that I had come from Town A, knew everyone there, and could find a ride home. It was late and I figured he needed to get his family where they were going. That's when he told me that he was from Town B and that he had a full gas can waiting at his house, and that he would take me there and bring me back to my car to fill it up. Still trying to be polite. I told him it was unnecessary, and my house was on the way to Town B, just a few miles away, and he could drop me off there. He didn't reply. I started to feel like something was off. I'm from an area where people go out of their way to help others, but it seemed like too much. I had insisted numerous times that he didn't have to drive nearly 30 miles out of his way to get me gas. He could simply drop me off on his way to his destination, or if he wanted to make sure I made it home fine, he could drop me off at home. In my uneasiness, I started making small talk. I asked him his name, and his last name was unfamiliar to me, which was surprising, but not totally unbelievable, coming from a town of around 3,000 people where I had spent the first decade of my life, and where both of my parents still worked. I remember wishing that I had paid attention to the construction company name on the side of the truck, since most companies in my area were named after a family. As we got closer to the turnoff to my house, I started to get more frantic. I realized that these people, who didn't even seem overly friendly, were insisting that we drive completely out of the way, late at night, in a rural community to fix a fairly commonplace mishap. I had no idea who they were. I had never seen them before, and I had no cell phone reception, and their cell phone was undetectable. Even if it wasn't what they were trying to do, making me disappear would be a pretty easy task. I started kind of shrieking that they just dropped me off at my house, but nobody in the car seemed like they heard me. Finally, in a fit of panic, I screamed at the top of my voice, "This is my town. Take me home. Please take me home right now." Finally, for the first time, the wife spoke up, yelling at the man angrily and somewhat annoyed. Just fucking take her home. Outside of the girl's grunting, the car fell silent. He swerved angrily onto my road, pulled into my driveway, let me out, and then reversed out of the driveway so fast the tires spit gravel and I couldn't even see the license plate or the name of the company through the dust. I ran inside and woke up my parents to tell them what happened. They just yelled at me because I was driving past curfew. I don't know for sure what the intentions were, and maybe they just wanted to help, but I felt really uneasy the whole time. Not as scary as some stuff on here, but that's my experience. Terrorized for 2 hours. This happened when I was in college. I lived in Isla Vista, the student community at UCSB, notorious for being a party school. It fully lived up to its reputation. I liked to party, but holy shit, these people were off the wall. As such, there were a lot of people who put themselves in dangerous situations, drinking to excess, not being careful, not locking doors, etc. It had a very isolated and insular vibe, and anyone who was hanging around who wasn't college age immediately looked out of place and strange. One night after having a few drinks, I came home to my small house where I lived with 2 other girls, probably around 2:30 a.m. We were all serious students. I was probably the least serious, actually. And when we partied, it was not your typical UCSB mega rager, more like a small get-together with friends. We would often have a few people spend the night, sleep on our furniture, in our beds, as the case may be. That night, my roommates had had a few people over who I didn't know, and I saw when I returned home that one of them opted to sleep on the couch from the shadow that I saw there. I didn't turn on the light so I wouldn't wake anyone up, but I was passing the couch to enter my bedroom. I noticed that the figure was lying very stiff. He just had this weird energy to him. He was lying down, but it was like he was putting all of his energy into lying as still and rigid as possible. I paused, and the guy quickly jerked his head to face me, without moving his limbs, so quickly that it startled me. I could see his wide open eyes glinting in the dark. Figuring that I'd startled him, or that he was drunk, or maybe some kind of stimulant and unable to sleep, I just hurried past into my bedroom and locked the door. The dude made me nervous, and I wasn't taking any chances. I fell asleep. At 4:30 a.m., I woke up. There was a strange sound at the door, almost like somebody was drumming their fingers against the wood very quietly. I lay still and listened. There were more quiet sounds, like someone scratching the door with their fingers, which got louder and louder until it was clear that he was using both hands and scratching as fast and as hard as possible. It created an extremely loud and intimidating sound that filled me with fear. I got my cell phone and texted my roommate because I was afraid to make a sound. "Your friend is freaking me out. Is he coked out? Can you talk to him? He's banging and scratching on my door." She didn't text me back, probably because she was asleep. I texted my other roommate to the same effect, covering all my bases. Keep in mind that the scratching had been going on at this point for a couple minutes. I have no idea how he could have sustained it. Scratching a wooden door with your fingernails can't feel good. He also grabbed at the knob and jiggled it super forcefully. Because neither of them answered, I decided to call and really wake them up, though I was scared to make a sound. I knew it sounds stupid, but there was something seriously horrifying about being teased like this through the door. I knew that he was trying to terrify me. I felt like a little kid, but I could tell this guy was fucked up or something, and maybe the police needed to be called. And I wanted to loop my roommates in since it was one of their friends. The scratching stopped abruptly, and I called my roommate, who answered sleepily. "Yo, your friend is messed up. Can you please deal with it? Do we need to call the cops? He's seriously scaring me, and he was scratching at my bedroom door. Really fucking weird." She didn't say anything for several seconds, and when she did speak, her voice had no sleepiness in it at all. "What friend?" she said. "That fucking guy that was sleeping on the couch?" I said. She was quiet again. "We didn't have any guys over," she said. "Call the police." My adrenaline surged, and I told her to please lock the bedroom door as quickly as possible. I realized that I hadn't heard scratching in a while and had no clue where the dude had gone. Suddenly, I heard a loud banging on the other side of the house, where my roommates, Lauren and Monica, shared a bedroom. The bangs were followed by the sounds of them screaming in fear. I quickly dialed the police as this maniac proceeded to bang against the, luckily, locked bedroom door of my two roommates as they screamed. The heaviness of the blows left no doubt that he was trying to break the door down. I told the 911 operator the situation, and she dispatched 2 squad cars. The police in Isla Vista are generally used to peeling drunks off the sidewalks and breaking up brawling frat bros. This was really serious and strange, and I think the dispatcher got the sense from my tone how terrified I was, and she stayed on the phone with me. At one point, the banging stopped and everything was quiet for a while. I talked with the dispatcher and suddenly looked down to see that this guy had slipped his fingers through the 1-inch gap between my door and the floor and was just kind of wiggling them around, making this weird growling sound. I screamed and backed away, which is my biggest regret about this situation, since when I look back, it would have been so awesome to just stomp the shit out of those fingers and hear the guy howl in pain. When the cops rolled up, I heard running and the sound of our sliding glass door opening and closing. Then he was gone. The cops never caught him. He had broken in through our side door by jimmying the lock somehow. My door was covered in what turned out to be huge gouges he had made using a pair of scissors, which he discarded on the ground before he left. What terrifies me the most about this was that I walked right past him. I looked him right in the face. I realized now that he was not trying to sleep or on drugs, but was lying so stiff like that because he was hiding. He probably heard me open the door, and freaked out because he hadn't realized there was another girl living there, and tried to blend into the couch in the darkness. Stalkers in the Canyon. About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA County. Bordering my town was a large cavernous region known as Turnbull Canyon. It's the kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area emphatically known as Hell's Gate. Stories of cultic activity, gang killings, abandoned mental health institutions, and the like. The kind of shit you hear about any place old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of the stories were spurned from a tragedy that occurred years prior. A woman's body was found at the base of the canyon, and from then on the rest is history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon in order to take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon was about a 30-minute drive from our campus, and we had been listening to the King of Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambience to get me feeling pretty anxious about our little excursion. I should also note that I'm a pretty anxious guy in general. So traveling out to a remote area preceded by its reputation for scary occurrences admittedly had me thinking twice about the decision. At the top of the canyon, there's a small residential area and a few ritzy houses, surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture into the canyon itself, you have to follow a main trail with several smaller arteries that split off in other directions, but ultimately culminate, after a couple miles or so, at the base of a steep hill adorned with a small water tower overlooking the city. Anyhow, we parked our car at the top of the canyon road, divided up the camera gear, and made our way out to the trail ahead. Around 1 a.m. at this point, after walking the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave, the photographer, decided it was time to set up his first shot while Jeff, our other friend, and I kept watch. Eventually, he got the shot he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 or so minutes before Dave decided to set up his next shot. At this point, the trailhead had disappeared behind us completely, and we were a little less than a quarter of the way to the water tower. While setting up the tripod, we noticed the faint glow of headlights off in the distance, which was strange because the trail isn't meant for cars, nor is it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall, it's only about 5 feet wide, with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a bit of a red flag for us, as we were the only people out there, so we immediately packed up our things and ducked off into the brush, waiting for the car to pass on. Eventually, an old pickup truck idled to a stop about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis, the bed of which was missing entirely. Growing up in the country, I knew it was the type of truck typically owned by backwoods folk who lived in the boonies and preferred to be left to their own devices. We watched in agonizing anticipation as the truck just idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails, the roar of the engine echoing throughout the canyon. Clearly, we were spooked at this point, the three of us speculating as to our next step. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, while Dave assured us that it was probably nothing, perhaps just a guy off-roading, as he put it. So, with great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behind Dave towards the water tower to get his final shot. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading for fun in the woods, but never on finicky canyon trails barely wide enough to hike on, let alone drive. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for about an hour, we finally made it out to the water tower, climbed the hill to the top, and took the view of the city. Dave, once again, started setting up his equipment while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower, keeping watch just in case the truck came back. Nothing. At this point, it's around 3 a.m. Dave decided that he'd got all the shots he needs, so we pack up our equipment and commit to heading back before it gets too late, seeing as how all of us have classes in just a few hours. Just as we were preparing to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back onto the trail, at which point the driver attempts to climb the hill, revving the engine loudly. Scared shitless, the three of us slid off the side of the hill into the brush, clinging to plates and rocks. As the truck finally made it to the top of the hill, slowly driving around the tower, we could see the glow of the headlights each time it circled above us. After waiting for nearly 10 minutes, while also trying not to make any noise, the truck eventually descended the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail no more than 100 yards away. We watched as a scruffy man, mid-50s, stepped out of the idling truck and into the glow of its headlights, moseying around while looking at the ground. He then knelt down, looking at something in the dirt, surveying the area intently, As he did so, it became increasingly apparent that he was tracking something. Our footprints. This next part still chills me to the bone, as my friends and I huddled together watching in complete terror. Another man wearing a long, dark polka emerged from the brush, right where we have been hiking, joining the other man at his side. Apparently, he had been out there the entire time we were walking the trail, just watching us, following behind at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a long while, but we couldn't hear a word. They continued scanning the area, looking at our footprints, but eventually got in the truck and drove down one of the forks in the trail. We sat in silence for a long time and waiting nearly 2 hours just to ensure the coast was clear, at which point we made like hell back to the car, down the hill, and back to our campus, just in time for class. Hey, if you're a fan of the MrSleepy channel, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the weekly uploads. I saw this at night. Back in the mid-'80s, I was camping with my parents and a friend next to the Columbia River in Oregon. It was one of those KOA-type places my mom liked, but pleasant enough given that it wasn't overly crowded while we were there. My friend and I slept in a tent pitched next to the trailer and were up really late one night playing Risk and drinking copious amounts of soda. Both of us had to go to the bathroom and decided to go up to the campus facilities instead of waking my parents by using the trailer toilet. Everyone else in the camp was fast asleep, but it was really noisy out due to all the frogs and crickets. On the walk up, neither of us were talking. And about halfway there, the hair on the back of my neck started to stand up, and I got this weird chilled sensation. My friend stopped and put his arm out to stop me and put his finger to his lips in a gesture to keep quiet. That's when I realized that there was no noise. Anywhere. No frogs. No crickets. Nothing. I had this urge to bolt back to the tent, but it wasn't strong enough to actually get me moving. I looked over to my friend and he was staring up at the sky. I looked up too and didn't realize what I was seeing until the stars started appearing off to my left, slowing appearing from left to right. It was as if something gigantic was in the sky, blotting out the stars. But the way the stars were reappearing, it must have had a straight trailing edge. Imagine yourself holding up a big piece of cardboard above your head at night, moving it from left to right. It felt like that. No lights though, no color, no noise, only the sensation of nothingness slowly moving off to our right. I don't know how long we watched, but by the time the stars had all reappeared up to the tops of the trees over by the river, the frogs and crickets had started to make noise again. We had talked about what we thought it was before falling asleep and decided to keep quiet about it the next day in hopes of hearing someone else in camp talking about it, but heard nothing. We stayed there for a couple more days after that, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. By the way, the weather while we were there was beautiful with no clouds or fog. It still creeps me out to this day, but at the same time fascinates me as to what it might have been. Being followed in the woods. Me, my parents, and my friend were camping at Tuckahoe State Park, and the last night we were staying there was very creepy. Me and my friend were hiking the trails all day, and we thought it would be a good idea to go to the lake to watch the sunset and talk about random things. There was a red car sitting in the parking lot near us, but we didn't see anyone around. This is important to know. It was almost dark out, so we decided to leave, but I had to go to the bathroom. When we got in the bathroom, there were no lights, so it was pitch black. I had to have my friend shine a flashlight. I was washing my hands, and this strange alarm started to go off, so me and my friend ran out of there, kinda creeped out. When we did get out of the bathroom, it was dark, and we had to walk back into a mile trail back to our campsite. When we walked in the woods, my friend swore she seen a person standing in the near entrance of the path watching us walk onto the trail. The walk seemed so long and dreadful. I had this feeling someone or maybe even something watching us. Not even a few minutes on the trail, I heard fast-moving footsteps and I started to see things out of the corners of my eyes. We decided to call my parents and tell them to hurry and come to the trail we were on. My friend's phone was about to die and that was the only way we could have a light. After what seemed like ages of having the feeling of someone watching you and following you, we saw flashlights and noticed it was my parents. We ran and started telling them everything, but they didn't believe us. The next day, we were packing up our things, and I looked over, but there was the same red car just a few camping spots down from us. After that, I was ready to get out of there, just knowing that perhaps the same person was just a few spots down from me. Wait, it wasn't you? A few years ago, I went camping for the first time in my life. I was about 11 or 12 when we headed out to a forest nearby our house. We were in Poland for the holidays, as every year, and right next to our house was a huge forest. So one day we decided to take out my mom's old tent she still had from like the 90s and just stay for the night or two in between some wildlife. Good thing, the place we chose to sleep at was only about 20, maybe 30 minutes away from the house. Bad thing, there are a lot, and I mean a lot of wolves, foxes, and boars out in that forest, and honestly I kind of regretted going out there in the first place. We set everything up around 6 p.m. and my sister and I set up the campfire. My dad chopped down a smaller tree earlier with his oak axe, important for later part of the story, and by now it had dried out enough to catch fire. We sat around it for quite some time, probably around 4 hours, until it was dark, so we decided to just head back to sleep then. My two sisters and I on one end of the tent and my parents on the other. It was probably just the fear of getting eaten alive by some wolves or homesickness, but I couldn't sleep at all. I heard my dad tell my mom he was going out into the forest to get some firewood for the morning while it was still fairly dry, or it would have soaked up all the dew by then. The thought of not having my dad around made it even worse for me to even close my eyes for a second. I'm not too good at telling what time it is by just staring at the sky, or trying to figure out how long it has been. So I'll just say it was around 12 or 1 in the morning. I was actually falling asleep when I heard some rattling outside the tent. My first thought, wolf. I was terrified and just popped out my head through the little curtain that separated the two halves of the tent, basically a piece of thin fabric just hanging on some threads, to see if my dad was back. He was still gone, and it had been about an hour since he went. I lay back down and just tried to fall asleep, but when I turned myself on my side, I saw this faint human shadow outside the tent. I froze and let out a teeny squeak. The person seemed to be holding some sort of axe, shovel-type thing in its hand, so I thought it may have just been my dad back. The shadow walked towards the entrance of the tent and just stood there at the zipped-up door for maybe 30 seconds. I began to wonder why he wasn't just coming inside. The person finally ran off into the forest, but dropped the axe. You could hear the footsteps fade in the distance and a thump just appear along the way. Maybe a minute or so later, I hear my dad walking back from the opposite side of the forest and enter the tent all tired and just fell asleep. Seemed kind of sketchy and fishy and scary to me, but it was so late, I couldn't even think anymore and I somehow fell asleep. The next morning, I woke after my dad dropped his phone on his face, letting out an ouch. I peeped through the curtain at him and he just smiled back while rubbing his nose. I needed some fresh air because I was feeling a bit sick. Maybe from the nerves in the morning or homesickness. I couldn't really tell. Both of us got out of the tent and walked around for a while. We circled around the campsite for around 10 minutes until we came back to our tent. That's when I noticed something that ran the chills down my back. A few meters from the tent, in the corner of my eye, I managed to catch a glimpse of something red. It took me a hot second to realize I actually saw something and turned my head to see what it was. It was a red and black rubber axe. It was not there before. I knew it wasn't my dad's because he was by the pile of wood he collected at night. From my dad's reaction, I probably turned pale because he started to freak out a little, like I was about to pass out or something. He turned his gaze to where I was looking, and we both just stared for a few seconds before he called out for the rest of the family to wake up and get moving. We were all packed up within an hour and we rushed back home. I later told my dad what I saw that night and he wouldn't believe me at first. I carried on with the story and he finally realized I was telling the truth. To this day, I still have no clue who the duck that was. But I'm just happy he didn't investigate our tent any further or any other animal out in that forest. Something bad happened while I was camping. I'm not sure what. I'm not sure if I'm in the right place. But I've held this story in for the last 6 years because it sounds crazy and I got told not to talk about it. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we picked was beautiful. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere. Absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back and had dinner. It was all very normal until we woke up the next day. I need to give some context as to how we slept that night so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler and a stereo that we brought in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest the door of the tent with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning and I felt fine. I had slept hard and from inside the tent everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces laying next to a tree. All the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence just taking everything in. The woods felt off now. It was quiet and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about those woods felt wrong now. My ex accused me of not locking the car the night before and that an animal got into our stuff. I promised that I had locked it and went into the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up and we were almost home and told me that he had a dream the night before about something kneeling over him in the tent holding his gun, just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night. Guy disturbs us in the middle of nowhere. I'm a 19-year-old female and a 23 male very short, and a friend, 21 female, I know for a couple of years. We went camping earlier in 2020 in a big park, and around 12:30, a kind of drunk-looking old man came up to us on his bike playing policeman, saying that we weren't allowed to stay because we were disturbing the wildlife. He had been arguing with my boyfriend for the past 45 minutes. At that point, I have had enough. He would not leave us alone, and when I walked away from him, he yelled he was going to call the police on me for walking away from him. I was drunk, angry, and tired. If I didn't walk away, I would have probably beaten the guy up, to be honest. I walked away and called the police on him. He was annoying and creepy. We were just about to go to sleep when he came up to us. This is a park in the middle of a city. There is no wildlife other than the homeless people and some sheep here. The police said that they wanted to talk to him, so I walked back and put it on the speaker, and finally, he walked away after the police told him to leave us alone. The police said we were not allowed to be there, but they didn't bother. The policeman on the phone was very nice and understanding. It was my boyfriend and a good friend out in this park in a tent. Imagine a possibly drunk/high old guy coming up to you in the middle of a park in the middle of the night, not leaving you alone. Yes, I called the police. I didn't feel safe. The guy yelled at us for just having a tent on the grass. Forgot to write this at first, but he tried taking a picture of us as some kind of evidence. We didn't want him to take our picture, so he said so. He was still trying to take a picture of us, though. Told us that he would stay and look at us till we left. He yelled multiple times that we weren't doing it fast enough. Camping gone wrong. It was mid-November. I had to find a place to camp, but since I was lazy, I decided to wait a week before the actual weekend. A week before the weekend, I decided to call some owners so I can have a place to sleep. As I call many numbers, all of the owners are unavailable or simply not here. But then I see a number which I have never called before. Since it is at the end of the list, I call, and an old lady pick up the phone. I do the basics, presentations and all. She agreed to let me and my team stay at hers, and we are making agreements. The afternoon, I go to her property to check everything such as portable water, the place to put the tent and the campfire. The place is kind of dark, but it's nice. The week passed and Saturday arrives. The Saturday is ending well. We did some great games, we ate a lot, and had a good night show. As they go to sleep in the tent, I stay awake to finish paperwork for the next day. It is now midnight and I decide to go to sleep because we have to wake up early to go to church. As I switch off the flashlight, one of my newbie, we are 8 in total, wants to go to the toilets, aka a tree, and asks me to come with her. I can understand because it's better to be accompanied at night, especially in the woods. So she does her business, and I suddenly hear some noises far away, but not that far. I tell myself it's nothing. It must be some animals trying to find food. We go back to the tent, and that's when I hear footsteps approaching. As I hear those footsteps, I remain calm and tell myself maybe it's the old lady checking if we didn't make the fire too close or something. But I still have an odd feeling because it's midnight, and why would she do this at this hour? Then I hear no more footsteps for about 10 minutes. Then I hear some coming to our tents. Thankfully, all of my girls are sleeping. Because they have been scared. I was the oldest one. They were about 3 or 4 years younger. As I hear footsteps which seem to come from one person, I hear others coming from the back of the tent. And I was like, okay, this is getting weird. I need to do something. I checked the tent by the inside, and thank God, one of my newbies left some embers from the fire, so I could see what happens between the fire and the zip of my tent. A minute passed by, and a silhouette is there just between the fire and my tent. I stopped breathing. I literally froze. I started to move towards my phone when I saw the silhouette coming closer to the zip of the tent. I sent a message to one of my bosses who are always camping in the near areas if something happens. But I know she would take too long, so I had to think of something. And think fast. That's when I had an idea. I put my alarm on like a big siren, because sometimes we would do like night games and wake up in the middle of the night. So I put my bell on and my girls woke up. The silhouette had started to unzip. I actually saw fingers from below. But as the silhouette heard my girls waking up, she or he sprinted back to where he came from. That's when I saw two other silhouettes sprinting back in the same direction. Everything ended well. 20 minutes later, my boss came and stayed the night, and I never had to deal with those silhouettes again, thankfully. I witnessed something with a few friends in the woods 9 years ago that haunts me till this day. Me and some of my buddies used to go to this place called Profile Rock in Freetown, Massachusetts. Late at night, sometimes 2 to 3 in the morning. One night during the summer, I go to Profile Rock with 3 of my friends at 2:30 a.m. just to mess about and explore. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but Profile Rock and the area we were in is part of an area called the Bridgewater Triangle, which is the site of alleged paranormal activities and also one of the most haunted areas in the state I live in. Continuing on, we climbed Profile Rock itself, stayed on top of it for maybe 3 to 4 hours, and we all decided to leave. Now, as you're leaving Profile Rock, you have to go down this long path that's about 2 miles long to get back to where we parked our car. 2 of my friends are walking about 20 to 30 feet in front of me and my other friend. Now I'll never know why I turned around. I didn't have a feeling like someone was watching us. I just simply turned around because besides the moonlight shining through the trees in certain areas, we only had cell phone flashlights to make our way around. I remember turning around and seeing someone running at us from about 150 feet away full speed. What threw me off wasn't that they were running at us, it was how they were running. You know how a zombie walks in a horror movie dragging one of its legs, almost limping? That's how this someone was running at us. At first, I didn't say anything and possibly assumed it was one of my friends or someone that was already in there who got injured and needed assistance, until this someone made it to an area of the path where the moonlight reached through the trees and gave them some perspective. What I saw still chokes me up to this day. You ever see a child try to draw a person? How they make a stick figure most of the time? That's exactly how this someone looked. I caught maybe a 10-second glance as it was running under the moonlit trees, but I saw no distinguishable facial features. No eyes, no mouth, and no ears. Its arms and legs looked like that of an extremely malnourished person, only completely black, and it didn't look like skin or any type of clothing from what I could see. I almost can't even describe it, to be honest, and you could blatantly tell it wasn't a mask or one of those Halloween blacked out suits. I recall calling out to my friend in a panicked voice, who was walking with me, who is now maybe 10 feet ahead of myself. I shined my cell phone light on him as he was looking where I was just looking, and I could tell right away from his facial expression that I wasn't seeing things. It was now maybe 40 feet away from us, if that, almost the same distance as our friends in front of us, and me and my friend just took flight and started running. My other friends in front of us shot around and asked what was wrong, and I replied, "Just run." And all 4 of us jetted for our car. I remember taking a glance back as we were running, and there was nothing there, even though whatever was chasing us would certainly be on our tails by now. We all hopped in the car, and my friend who was walking with me yells, "Dude, tell me you saw that. What the fuck was that?" I told him I seen the same thing. I asked him to describe to all of us what he saw, and he described literally the exact same thing I witnessed. By now, my other 2 friends are thinking we were joking around or messing with them, until my friend who was walking with me swore on his father, who has passed away not even a month ago, that he's telling the truth. I was kind of frustrated, to be honest, because I couldn't believe my other 2 friends didn't see it as they turned around to question why we were running, but it doesn't matter now. We actually went back there with a few more people the day after and witnessed nothing, of course. I'll never know what it was or who it was or what it wanted. But I know one thing, there's no way in hell 2 people both imagined seeing some stick figure specter in the woods. Something strange that I still think back on. When my cousin and I were younger, we spent a great deal of time together. We would get into all sorts of mischief, as boys do. I was staying over at my aunt and uncle's visiting my cousin one weekend when we came across something that, at the time, we didn't think to bring up to anyone older and smarter than we were. We live in South Carolina for what that's worth, and we were around the age of 12 and 8, me being the older of the two. The area around my aunt and uncle's house has some small, densely wooded areas. But overall, the area isn't anything I'd consider rural. We decided to explore an area of woods across from my aunt and uncle's house, a spot we hadn't really explored much of. Not too far from the road, we came across an old house. It wasn't in bad shape, and even had a little garden with a well enough tended flower bed. Our first thought was, reasonably enough, that we'd run into someone's yard. Passing through, we noticed one of the windows to the home was broken, so decided to peek inside. There wasn't much of anything in the house. It was devoid of furniture or anything else that would imply that someone actually lived there. Naturally, we tried the doors to see if we could get in. No luck. We then heard a car pulling up to the house from the opposite side to us. My cousin and I darted for the tree line and followed some power lines into the nearby woods. A large section of the woods here had been cleared out to allow for the power lines to be where they were. So picture a clearing of around 100 or so feet surrounded by woods on either side. After following the power lines for quite a bit, we got hit by an unmistakable smell of something dead. We kept on and noticed a wooden tower stand off the side through the woods a bit. We excitedly hurried to investigate it. On the way, we found a dead dog. That would explain the smell. Nothing too unusual. Then we found another, and another. Surrounding the entire stand were the corpses of dead dogs. It had to be over 30 carcasses. They were all in varying states of decay. Some seemed only a few days old. Some were nothing but bones. We were alarmed, but still dumb kids and wanted to climb to the top. So we did. At the top, we found even more dog carcasses. So process this. Not only were there bodies of dead dogs surrounding this tower stand, someone put forth the effort to drag them some 30 feet up a slim ladder to the top. Unsettled, we made our way back to my aunt and uncle's after that. We never mentioned it to anyone, or at least I never did. Thinking back on it, 15 years later, we definitely should have said something. I've tried looking up similar things in the area, but haven't had any luck. We never went back there after finding that horrible scene. I also wouldn't conclude that the house we found or the person that showed up there are in any way related to the tower stand. That's just how our story began. Something messed with our car in the woods. This happened to me when I was 17, around the time when most of my friends were just getting their driver's license. We all had that rush for cars back then, so it was quite common for us to skip school and go for a ride out of town. The city where I live is surrounded by forests and 2 mountains, so we basically had a lot of places to go and chill. One day my friend was very excited to show us a place that he found about online, possibly here on Reddit, for which people said was quite odd. We looked it up and apparently it had a reputation for being a paranormal site. Being the typical group of teens, we collectively agreed to check it out ASAP, including me, who more or less believes in spiritual stuff. Going up the mountain, we were listening to the radio until we lost the station to static, which for obvious reasons is what the radio does when you go deep into the woods. This entire experience is happening during a summer night, so we were feeling pretty careless and as excited as a person can be, having no music to listen to. We started talking and discussing our expectation for this place, with most of us having no expectations at all. Our conversation was suddenly interrupted by the loud static coming from the radio that we turned off just a few minutes ago. We were all a bit startled, but still nothing out of the ordinary. It happened again a few minutes later. We all looked at the radio. It was still off. We quickly dismissed this as something that radios do for some reason, and again didn't pay much attention. The third time that it happened, the driver hit the brakes and stopped the car. He turned to us and yelled, "Fuck me, did you hear that? What was that?" Claiming that he heard a voice this time. None of us heard anything except static. The driver said he has had enough and switched the engine off. So there is no possible way for anything, including the radio, to be working. We sat like that for a while in pitch black, for there were no city lights around us and the forest had covered all other light sources like stars, etc. You couldn't distinguish a night sky. That's how dark it was. The light indicating the radio turned on, and soon after the static came. I could tell we were all feeling a bit anxious by then. Through the static came a female voice singing, and it was very silent. For a second it got louder, then fell back to silent again, and then vanished. But even weirder, the static vanished too. Once we switched the car back on and turned the headlights on too, we observed what seemed to be smudges of fingers across the fucking windshield. We didn't turn the car around immediately, but I could tell that we all just wanted to leave. We stopped further up on a hill, took some pictures of the Milky Way, and went home afterwards. Ever since, we speculate about what the fuck happened to the radio and windshield that night. My friends went 2 more times without me to the same place, recording the same, including feeling a small push once the car was off.